This is the Roman Empire at the start of the 1st century AD. On its eastern edge sits a small province, Judea. It's here that a new faith begins to take root and spread across the empire, Christianity. Within just 3 centuries, it will become the empire's official religion, and at the center of it all is the figure of a prophet named Jesus. For years, the question of whether he actually existed has puzzled historians and scholars of early Christianity. Let's start with a quick disclaimer though. When we talk about the historicity of Jesus, we're only asking one thing. Was there a real person behind the biblical figure? We're not getting into whether he walked on water, rose from the dead, turned water into wine, or had wise men show up at his birth. That's territory for theologians, not historians. So what kind of evidence do we actually have that Jesus existed? Honestly, not much. There are no archaeological finds that directly prove his existence, but that's not unusual when it comes to the ancient world. Unless you were a king, an emperor, or someone incredibly important, the chances of leaving behind physical evidence are almost zero. That means that we're mostly left with written sources from people who lived around that time. These sources fall into 2 camps, Christian and non-Christian. We're not going to rely on Christian sources, like the New Testament or apocryphal texts. At best, those can serve as supporting material, but when their claims are backed up by non-Christian sources or archaeological evidence. You might be wondering, why dismiss the Christian sources right away? The reason is simple. A text cannot prove itself. If we accept that the Gospels alone are proof that Jesus existed, then we'd also have to believe that Greek myths prove Hercules was real, or that Batman exists because we have comic books about him. Sorry, but that's not how historical evidence works. Among non-Christian sources, the most significant reference comes from the Jewish historian Josephus, in a passage known as the Testimonium Flavianum. Josephus was born into a wealthy family of Jewish priests. In his early years, he took part in the Jewish revolt against Rome, but after being captured, he switched sides, adopted Roman customs, gained his freedom, and eventually became a Roman citizen. He spent the rest of his life at the imperial court in Rome, though he remained a practicing Jew. He wrote 2 major historical works, the Jewish War and the Antiquities of the Jews. Here's what Josephus says in the Antiquities. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them spending a 3rd day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe who call themselves Christians after him has still to this day not disappeared. Well, that all sounds pretty clear. Case closed, right? What else is there to say? Well, not so fast. There's actually a lot of controversy around Josephus' testimony. Many scholars believe the original text was either partially edited or completely rewritten by later Christian copyists. The word Christ is simply the Greek translation of the Aramaic Mashiach, meaning anointed one or Messiah. Back then, the biggest difference between Jews and Christians was whether or not they believed Jesus was the Messiah. Christians believed he was the one foretold in the Old Testament and called him the Christ. Jews firmly rejected that idea. So it's pretty unlikely that Josephus, a devout Jew and a member of the conservative Pharisee sect, would have written that Jesus was the Christ. On top of that, the language used in the passage doesn't sound like Josephus at all. It includes phrases and vocabulary typical of Christian writing. In fact, some parts closely match the Nicene Creed and even the works of the Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea. The last line of Josephus' testimony also raises some red flags. In his time, Jesus' followers didn't actually call themselves Christians. That term started out as a Roman legal label used to describe members of this new sect. It was the Romans who coined the word. Early followers of Jesus called themselves the righteous or the just. The term Christian didn't come into regular use among believers until the late 2nd century, about 100 years after the Antiquities of the Jews was written. So when Josephus says that Jesus' followers call themselves Christians, it sounds out of place. So does that mean that this whole passage is a fake? Not quite. There are some solid reasons to think at least part of it is authentic. In the 3rd century, the Christian theologian Origen criticized Josephus for not calling Jesus the Messiah. Yet, about a century later, the Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea quotes the version that we know today, the one that does say Jesus was the Christ. That suggests the original passage mentioned Jesus but didn't identify him as the Messiah, and that someone later edited the text to make it sound more Christian. Origen was likely reading the original version while Eusebius was quoting from one that had already been revised, so the edits probably happened sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries. This theory is supported by Arabic and Syriac translations of Josephus's work, which preserve versions of the passage without the explicitly Christian language. Here's a comparison. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders. As you can see, the key points of Christian theology are missing from this version of the text. This is probably much closer to what Josephus originally wrote. It was likely preserved because it was translated into Syriac and Aramaic before Christian edits were made, and later into Arabic. Now let's look at what the Roman historian Publius Cornelius Tacitus had to say. In the year 64, a massive fire broke out in Rome, nearly destroying the entire city. At that time, the emperor was Nero, infamous for his madness and cruelty. After the fire, rumors started spreading that Nero himself had ordered the city to be set ablaze. Here's how Tacitus tells it. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. According to Tacitus, Nero used the Christians as scapegoats, blaming them for the great fire that nearly destroyed Rome. He took advantage of the fact that, for reasons we're not entirely sure of, early Christians were already widely disliked in the city. Most historians agree that this passage from Tacitus is genuine. The writing style and vocabulary match the rest of his work, and there are no obvious anachronisms. The tone of the passage also makes it hard to believe that it was a Christian forgery. Tacitus clearly despised Christianity, calling it a superstition and an evil, and describing Christians as people marked by abominations. If a Christian scribe had invented or altered the text, you'd expect them to clean it up or at least make it more sympathetic. But they didn't. But the one odd detail is that Tacitus refers to Pontius Pilate as a procurator. In reality, Judea was governed by prefects until 44 AD, after which the title procurator came into use. Tacitus, born around 55 AD, probably just used the title that was familiar in his own time. Jesus also gets a brief mention from Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, who served as a secretary to Emperor Hadrian. In the 5th book of the Lives of the Caesars, while writing about Emperor Claudius, Suetonius notes, "He expelled the Jews from Rome for constantly causing disturbances at the instigation of Christus." What's especially interesting here is the spelling, Christus with an E instead of Christus with an I, which we're much more familiar with today. But that really wasn't that unusual at the time. In fact, Christus spelling didn't become standard until the 5th century AD. In ancient Greek, Christos meant good, and early Christians often leaned into this wordplay, referring to Jesus as the Good Shepherd. This passage from Suetonius is generally seen as authentic, especially since the expulsion of Jews from Rome during Claudius's reign is likely backed up by a rescript he'd issued to the Jews of Alexandria. In it, Claudius forbade them from inviting relatives from Judea and Syria, likely in response to similar unrest. Suetonius also mentions Christians again in the 6th book of the Lives of the Caesars, in his section on Nero. He writes, "Punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a group of people devoted to a new and dangerous superstition." It's pretty clear he's referring to the same events that Tacitus described, which adds even more weight to the authenticity of Tacitus's account. Jesus also gets a mention from Pliny the Younger, a Roman author and governor of the province of Bithynia, in a letter he wrote to Emperor Trajan. In this letter, Pliny asks how he should handle legal cases against Christians and refers to Christ several times. For example, he writes, "They would sing hymns to Christ as to a god in turns." The letter and Trajan's response doesn't tell us much about Jesus himself, but it does show that by the early 2nd century AD, both Pliny and Trajan were clearly familiar with who Jesus was. Interestingly enough, Pliny doesn't describe Jesus as a god, but rather notes that Christians worshipped him as one. The Greco-Syrian satirist Lucian also mentions Jesus twice in his work The Death of Peregrinus. First, he refers to someone who was crucified in Palestine for founding this new cult. And then later he adds, their first lawgiver convinced them that they were all brothers the moment they sinned, by rejecting the Greek gods, worshipping that crucified philosopher, and living by his teachings. Finally, the Syrian writer Marabar Serapion, in a letter to his son, writes, "What did the Athenians gain by killing Socrates? Famine and plague followed as punishment for their crime. What did the people of Samos gain by burning Pythagoras? Their land was buried in sand. And what did the Jews get by executing their wise king? Not long after, their kingdom was wiped out." It's clear that both Lucian and Marabar Serapion are talking about Jesus, even if they never mention him by name. And importantly, neither of these texts shows any sign of later Christian editing. They're considered authentic by the vast majority of modern historians. Another important question when talking about the historicity of a person is whether they actually fit into the time that they supposedly lived in. Could someone like that have realistically existed back then? Or is Jesus an anachronism? Based on non-Christian sources, here's what we know about Jesus. He was a Jewish preacher and a philosopher who taught in Judea, gained a following, and was executed by the Romans. And there's nothing about that seems out of place for the time. In fact, we know of more than 20 wandering preachers from roughly the same period, some of them even more well-known than Jesus. The most famous is John the Baptist, who also appears in non-Christian sources. There's even a religion that still exists today, Mandeism, where he's considered the main prophet. So yes, someone like Jesus absolutely could have existed. And just to be clear, when I say someone like Jesus, I'm not talking about the religious figure described in the Gospels. I mean the historical person described in non-Christian accounts, a traveling preacher who was executed by the Romans. If we approach Jesus the same way that we approach any other historical figure, we'd have to conclude that there was almost certainly a real person behind the biblical story. There are plenty of people from ancient history that we know far less about, sometimes just a single mention in one source, yet historians don't question that they existed. Take Pythagoras, for example. We don't have a single reference to him from his lifetime. The first written mentions show up at least 50 years after he died. And after his death, a kind of semi-religious movement grew around him, Pythagoreanism. Yet no one seriously doubts that he was a real person. The same goes for Jesus. At least that's the view of the overwhelming majority of scholars who have studied the topic. The video wouldn't be complete without addressing one of the main arguments put forward by those who believe Jesus was a myth. They often point out how strange it is that someone as important as Jesus, if he really existed, barely shows up in the writings of Roman historians. It's a bit like reading a history book about 19th century Europe and finding no mention of Napoleon. And the few references that do exist are often dismissed as later additions by Christian scribes. There are two main ways to respond to this. First, it's very possible that the historical Jesus simply wasn't a major figure in his own time. He could have been just another wandering preacher with a small group of followers who was eventually executed by the Romans. At the time of his death, he wasn't well known or influential, so it's not really surprising that contemporary historians didn't take much notice. After all, how many minor criminals executed in the Roman Empire do we know by name today? The cult surrounding Jesus only began to take shape after his death, once the Gospels started to circulate. That's at least one explanation. The other possibility is that more references to Jesus once existed, but didn't survive. For example, the Christian writer Tertullian mentions Roman imperial edicts about the persecution of Christians, but none of those documents have come down to us, aside from one letter from Emperor Trajan to Pliny the Younger. The Senate decree, Senatus Consultum, that supposedly authorized these persecutions is also lost, and yet Roman law had a clear principle, nulla pena sine lege, no punishment without a law. So the law must have existed, we just don't have it anymore. It's also worth remembering that during the Middle Ages, more than 100,000 copies of the Talmud were burned in Europe, mainly because it referred to Jesus as a false prophet. The only reason the Talmud survived at all is because there was a community, the Jews, who were determined to preserve it despite the danger. There's little doubt that many other texts that portrayed Jesus in a negative light or contradicted the Bible were lost in the same way. When it comes to the possibility of forgeries, absolutely, there are countless Christian forgeries of various supposedly historical documents. For example, fabricated letters between Pontius Pilate and Herod the Great, or between Pilate and the Emperor Tiberius, along with many other fakes. These kinds of forgeries are easily exposed by modern philologists. To show how this works, imagine someone trying to forge a newly discovered Shakespearean text. There's absolutely no way you could create a convincing fake unless you're a philologist specializing in early modern English from the late 16th to early 17th century. You might try, but you'd almost certainly make numerous mistakes, unaware of the spelling conventions, morphology, syntax, and vocabulary of that era. For example, you might unknowingly use words like pants, pocket, or napkin, but these words simply didn't even exist in Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare would instead say breeches or hose instead of pants, pouch or purse instead of pocket, and handkerchief instead of napkin. Using the modern terms would immediately give you away, or worse, you could have composed something that simply doesn't fit the language or culture of the period at all. For example, one Christian forgery mentions a Roman emperor named Theodore, even though no such emperor even existed. In another case, from the supposed letters between Herod and Pilate, Herod claims his daughter drowned in an ice hole. That alone shows the writer had no idea what the climate in the Middle East is like. It's hard to believe that a medieval monk with such limited knowledge could have produced a fake so convincing that modern linguists couldn't catch it. The references to Jesus we've looked at in this video, on the other hand, are the kind that are either widely accepted as authentic or considered at least partly genuine, like the account from Josephus. While working on the script for this video, we ended up diving deep into research on early Christianity and biblical studies. We actually gathered enough material to make another video, this time focused on who the historical Jesus might have been, based on what scholars and sources outside of the Bible suggests. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, let us know in the comments, give this video a like, and share it with your friends. We always take into account how a video performs when choosing topics for future episodes. If this video doesn't gain much traction, we'll probably just set the topic of early Christianity and the historical Jesus aside for a while. But if it does well, you can almost certainly expect a follow-up from us. Once again, if you've made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. We have a whole team behind this, and we really love seeing you follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations. We put out new content every single week. If you'd like to support the channel and help us make more videos like this, consider joining us on Patreon. You'll get early access to new episodes, work-in-progress updates, and more. Every bit of support goes a really long way. Thank you. You can also leave a super thanks down below if you'd like to give us a little extra boost. It really means a lot and helps us keep going. We hope to see you next time.